For nearly 2 decades Aziza's father was the father and grandfather of her children. Yes, you heard me right. This is not a story about a monster who hid in the shadows. This is about a predator who sat at the dinner table. Who taught algebra? Who directed music videos for Grammy-winning artists? Who walked his daughters down a path that should never exist? This is the story of Aziza Kibibi. And the 4 children she gave birth to, who were also her half-siblings. Welcome to Crimes Unveiled. But to understand how a father could do this to his daughter, how a mother could allow it, and how an entire family could be trapped in plain sight, we need to go back to the beginning. Paterson, New Jersey. Early 1980s. A city of immigrants, factory workers, and young families trying to carve out their piece of the American dream. 2 teenagers meet in high school. He's 18, charismatic, intelligent, with grand ideas about Black empowerment and African heritage. She's 17, Jamaican-American, from a proud family that values appearances above all else. They're young. They're in love. And then, she's pregnant. At 18 and 17 years old, they become parents to a baby girl. Aziza. By the time you're listening to this, you already know where this story goes. But for Aziza's first 8 years, this was simply a childhood. Complicated, yes. Strict, absolutely. But for a young girl living in her grandmother's attic in Paterson, it was all she knew. Her father, let's call him Aswad, worked as an interior designer and cabinet maker. Talented hands. A creative mind. He built custom furniture for wealthy families across New Jersey. He had ambition. He had vision. And he had control. The family lived cramped in that attic. Mattresses on the floor. Aziza, her younger siblings, her mother, her father, all sharing one space. Aswad believed in discipline. Not just structure, dominance. When Aziza misbehaved, she was beaten with belts. When she tried to visit her grandmother downstairs without permission, she was punished. When she accidentally destroyed a mango tree he was growing, the beating was severe enough that, decades later, she still remembers it with crystal clarity. But there were good days too. Aswad took his children blueberry picking. They visited the Statue of Liberty. They were homeschooled. Something that made them special in the eyes of their cousins who complained about public school. Aziza's mother, let's call her Deborah, ran a daycare in the grandmother's basement. She was building something of her own. Until Aswad decided she couldn't anymore. He told her the daycare was taking too much time. Too much attention away from him. From the family. From his vision. She complied. This would become a pattern. Every time Deborah succeeded at something, the daycare, hairstyling, fashion design, Aswad would shut it down. Not because they didn't need the money, but because he needed the power. Homeschooling. For some families, it's about religious freedom or educational philosophy. For Aswad, it was about isolation. He told his children that public schools were designed to oppress Black children. That teachers were racist. That the curriculum was propaganda. Some of this wasn't entirely wrong, but it was weaponized truth. What he didn't tell them was that isolation makes control easier. Aziza was the oldest daughter. And in Aswad's household, that meant she was a second teacher. At 8 years old, she was responsible for teaching her younger siblings to read, to write, to do mathematics. Her father taught the hard subjects, algebra, science. He taught it with a kung fu slipper in his hand. Get the answer wrong? A slap across the face. Her mother taught English and basic math. She graded the work. Gold stars for good performance. But here's what made Aziza different, she was good at it. She excelled. She absorbed information like a sponge and translated it for her younger siblings. She was responsible. She was obedient. She was perfect. And that perfection caught her father's attention. Aswad began complimenting Aziza more frequently. Telling her how proud he was. How responsible she'd become. How mature. One of her siblings later recalled. He looked at Aziza differently than he looked at us. Deborah noticed too. But she said nothing. In families like this, silence is a language. And everyone was fluent. If you are enjoying this content, like, subscribe and share to your loved ones. The day it started, Aziza was 8 years old. Her mother sent her to the bedroom to speak with her father. She walked in expecting another lecture. Maybe praise. Maybe punishment for something she'd forgotten. What she got instead would rewrite the architecture of her entire life. Aswad told her she'd been doing well with her schoolwork. That she was becoming a young woman. That he was proud of her. And then he said something that didn't make sense. I need to show you how to be a woman. All fathers do this with their daughters. Aziza didn't understand. But she trusted him. He was her father. He was the authority on everything in her world: education, religion, discipline, truth. He led her to the back room. A closet area that separated their apartment from her grandmother's house. And there, he molested her. An 8-year-old child doesn't have the framework to understand sexual abuse. Aziza knew something felt wrong. Her mother had taught her that no one should touch her private areas except for medical reasons. But this was her father. The man who knew everything. The man who decided what was true and what wasn't. When he asked if she liked it, she was too afraid to say no. Instead, she said, I don't want you to do it anymore. He did it anyway. And then he did it again the next week. And the week after that. And then almost every single night. For the next 20 years. By the time Aziza was 10 years old, the molestation had escalated to rape. Her father was now a man in his 20s. She was a child whose body hadn't finished developing. It hurt. It was traumatic. She barely slept. Sometimes only 2 hours a night, because her father would keep her awake. And then she'd have to wake up early to teach her siblings. To make breakfast. To write affirmations on the chalkboard. To pretend everything was normal. When Aziza was 10 years old, her father told her mother what he was doing. He told his wife. The mother of his children. And he gave her a reason. He said he was molesting Aziza to help her skin condition. Aziza suffered from severe eczema and untreated asthma. She was sick often, covered in rashes, struggling to breathe. Aswad, who considered himself a holistic herbalist, convinced Deborah that sexually abusing their daughter was removing negative energy from her body. And Deborah believed him. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe she just accepted it because accepting it was easier than confronting the truth, that she was married to a predator. That she was living in a house where her daughter was being raped every night. That she was choosing her husband over her child. Deborah came from a Jamaican family that valued respectability. Pride. Keeping up appearances. In her world, divorce was shameful. Single motherhood was failure. She'd already accepted Aswad's affairs. He practiced what he called polygamy, having multiple girlfriends who cycled through their lives. Deborah hated it. But she stayed. She was also a victim of his violence. He beat her. Threatened her. Controlled her income and her identity. But this was different. This wasn't just abuse of a wife. This was the destruction of a child. And she said nothing. Worse, she became jealous. Where are you watching from? Drop your locations in the comments below. If you made it to this point, drop your comment with I am still here. Let's see who is still watching. As Aziza got older, Deborah started blaming her. Telling her she'd stolen her husband. That she, Deborah, couldn't compete with a child because Aswad preferred children. Aziza was now responsible for her own rape. At 11 years old, Aziza tried to run away. The trigger? Her father caught her stealing a bite of his junior's cheesecake, a luxury dessert he bought but wouldn't share with his children. He said their palates weren't sophisticated enough. When he caught her, he dragged her into the bathroom and sodomized her. Held his hand over her mouth. Hit her across the head. "Don't ever take my cheesecake again." That was the moment Aziza realized this would never stop. She packed her things. Waited for everyone to be distracted. She planned to walk out through her grandmother's front door, avoid the family living room where her siblings watched TV. She made it to the door. And then her younger brother appeared behind her. "Aziza, if you run away, what's going to happen to us?" 11 words. One question. And Aziza turned around. She unpacked her bags. Begged her sister not to tell their father she'd tried to leave. And went back to the life she knew. Because by then, Aswad had already planted the seed: if you fight back, if you tell anyone, I'll molest your sisters instead. So Aziza stayed. And carried the weight of protecting children she couldn't actually protect. Because here's the truth she didn't know yet: he was already molesting them too. While Aziza was being raped at home, her father was building a career in the music industry. Aswad had started networking with celebrities and producers through his interior design work. Wealthy clients. Industry connections. And then, lightning struck. In the mid-1990s, the family's house was struck by actual lightning and burned down. During the rebuilding process, Aswad met someone who introduced him to Wyclef Jean of the Fugees. This was 1996. The Fugees were at the height of their fame. "Killing Me Softly" was about to become one of the biggest songs of the decade. And Aswad convinced them to let him direct their music videos. He directed "Killing Me Softly," a song about feeling exposed. About someone reading your life through music. The irony is almost unbearable. Suddenly, Aswad was moving in elite circles. He attended Diddy's white parties in the late 90s, exclusive events filled with celebrities, excess, and secrets. He came home with stories. Aziza was at home cooking food for his production company. She was the caterer. The teenage girl serving food to famous musicians while her father built his empire. And every night, he'd come back and rape her. Aswad was charismatic. People in the community saw him as a visionary. A spiritual leader. He'd hold court at local parks, talking about Black empowerment, African royalty, God's plan for his people. He was admired. He had a best friend who was an East Orange police officer. That officer visited the house, saw teenage girls with no boyfriends, never asked questions. Later, that officer admitted he suspected something. He told another friend. They gossiped about it. But no one called the police. This is how abuse continues. Not because no one knows, but because knowing isn't enough to make people act. If you are enjoying this content, subscribe and share with your loved ones to protect them or their neighbors from the same tragic happening to them in the future. Remember, Aziza could be any one of us. When Aziza was 13, Aswad stopped all schoolwork. No more lessons. No more teaching her siblings. Instead, the family focused entirely on renovating a house he'd purchased in East Orange. This wasn't a normal renovation. This was child labor. Aziza and her brother were taken to the house multiple times a week. They ripped down walls. Cleared debris. Did hard manual labor. If they didn't complete their tasks by the end of the day, they weren't allowed to eat. Aswad had now added starvation to his toolkit of control. And during those renovation days, when it was just Aziza, her brother, and their father at the house, Aswad would send the brother to another part of the property. And he'd take Aziza to the attic. It was freezing cold. There were holes in the floor. No walls. No windows. And there, he'd rape her. Eventually, the family moved into that house. 10 people. 1 room. Mattresses on the floor. No working plumbing. They used Home Depot buckets as toilets. This was where Aziza would give birth to her first child. In an unfinished house. With no medical care. surrounded by her siblings who'd been told to never speak about what was happening. The walls were finally built. But they were built around a secret. Aziza got her first period around age 13. 2 years later, she missed one. Then another. She told her mother. Her mother told Aswad. His reaction was measured. Detached. We'll see. But then morning sickness started. Severe, undeniable morning sickness. And Aswad accepted it. Aziza was 15 years old. Pregnant by her father. Living in a house with no finished rooms, no hospital access, no birth certificate waiting to be filled out. One of Aswad's girlfriends, yes, he still had multiple women living in and around the house, mentioned that babies born from incest might have deformities. Aswad exploded. Yelled at her. How dare she suggest his child would be anything less than perfect? But he didn't stop raping Aziza. He just became gentler because she was pregnant. This is what protection looked like in that house, reduced violence. The night Aziza went into labor, she didn't know she was in labor. She was 16 by then. She felt mild cramping, like menstrual pain, and thought she needed to use the bathroom. Everyone was asleep on mattresses in the one finished room. She got up, went outside to the Home Depot bucket they used as a toilet, and started pushing. She thought she was defecating. Instead, water splashed across the floor. She screamed for her mother. Deborah ran out. Then called for Aswad. He looked between Aziza's legs and said, "Her head is right there. Don't push." They carried her back to the room. Her siblings woke up. Dogs were barking. Aswad kept saying, "Don't push, she's coming too fast." But Aziza's body didn't cooperate. The baby shot out. Aswad caught her. Aziza tore during birth, she was only 16, her body hadn't fully matured. She couldn't breastfeed properly because her breasts weren't developed enough. But when she looked at her daughter, this baby with big, round saucer eyes, she fell in love. Finally, she thought, someone to love me. She stayed up all night just looking at her baby. Crying. Thinking about the trauma that led to this moment. And then her parents and siblings went back to sleep. Life continued. After the baby was born healthy, no visible deformities despite the incestuous conception, Aswad developed a new philosophy. He called it the royal bloodline. He'd been reading about Egyptian pharaohs. About Tutankhamun and Nefertiti. About Cleopatra. These rulers practiced incest to keep bloodlines pure. In Aswad's mind, he wasn't a child rapist. He was a king. A prophet. Ordained by God to create a special lineage of children who would repopulate the earth after humanity's destruction. He called them royal blue blood children. This wasn't just abuse anymore. It was ideology. Religion. Destiny. And it gave him permission to keep going. Aziza's daughter was placed on a pedestal. Aswad refused to use physical punishment on her, a privilege no other child in the house received. She was special. Pure. Royal. The other children were beaten. Starved. Controlled. But this child, Aziza's daughter, Aswad's daughter, Aziza's half-sibling, she was untouchable. And Deborah, Aziza's mother, became even more jealous. Aziza had been told that if she didn't fight back, if she stayed quiet, her father wouldn't touch her sisters. It was a lie. By the time Aziza was a teenager with a baby, she witnessed her father kissing one of her younger sisters. Not a paternal kiss. A romantic one. They saw Aziza watching. Her sister looked caught. Ashamed. Her father yelled at her to go back inside. That's how Aziza knew she hadn't protected anyone. Eventually, Aswad would molest 5 of his daughters. 4 by Deborah, 1 by a different mother. He used the same tactics with each one. He told them this was normal. That fathers did this. That they were special. That they were helping the family. And then he pitted them against each other. He showed favoritism. Created jealousy. Told one sister that Aziza had asked him to molest her. Told another that her sister was getting more attention. He made sure they would never unite against him. One sister became jealous of Aziza's attention from their father. She didn't understand it was rape. She thought it was favoritism. So she started trying to seduce him. Walking around naked. Sitting on his lap. She wanted his attention too. And he gave it to her. By the time that sister realized what was actually happening, it was too late. And she blamed Aziza for it. The family was cannibalizing itself. Aziza would become pregnant 4 more times by her father. The second pregnancy resulted in another daughter. Born at home. No medical care. It wasn't until that child was 2 years old and placed in foster care that doctors discovered she had PKU, phenylketonuria. A metabolic disorder that causes brain damage if untreated. She'd been slowly deteriorating. Covered in rashes. Developmentally delayed. And Aswad told Aziza it was because her milk was poisoned. Her negative energy was hurting the baby. The blame was always hers. The third pregnancy ended in miscarriage. The fourth pregnancy was different. This time, Aswad beat her throughout the pregnancy. The protection pregnancy usually offered was gone. Why? Maybe stress from losing his music industry connections. Maybe the baby was a boy and the testosterone created tension. Maybe he just didn't care anymore. Aziza blacked out from one beating. That baby, her son, was born malnourished. He started having seizures. Aziza's brother convinced their mother to let him take her and the baby to the hospital. At the hospital, Aziza filled out the intake form. And in a desperate act of courage, she wrote her father's name in both the father and grandfather boxes. Someone noticed. But it wasn't enough. When Aziza wrote her father's name twice on that hospital form, it triggered a red flag. Social workers were called. Questions were asked. But Aswad stormed into the hospital before anyone could get real answers. He cursed out the doctors. Accused them of trying to experiment on his son. Threatened Aziza. Threatened the siblings still at home. And somehow, he talked his way out of it. Social services took Aziza's children into foster care. But they left her other siblings in the house. With Aswad. The man who was actively abusing multiple daughters. The system saw a crack. But it didn't see the whole foundation crumbling. Aziza's children were placed with foster families. They were separated. Aziza was devastated, but it was also the first time her children were safe. Meanwhile, Aswad was still raping her. Still threatening her. Still in complete control. Aziza had to attend parenting classes and therapy sessions mandated by social services to get her children back. She was learning words she'd never heard before. Abuse. Pedophilia. Domestic violence. Things she'd lived through for over a decade but never had language for. And slowly, very slowly, she started to understand, this wasn't normal. This wasn't her fault. This was a crime. While her children were in foster care, Aziza got pregnant again. She was close to her due date. Social services mandated prenatal care, the first time she'd ever received it. But Aswad went with her to every appointment. Still in control. During one visit, Aziza started talking to a nurse. She was about to ask for help. About to finally tell someone the full truth. Her sister, who'd accompanied her that day, saw what was happening. And she called their father. Aswad made a decision. He was taking Aziza away from anyone who could help her. He was taking her out of state. They drove to Florida. To a campsite. And there, in a tent on a beach, Aziza gave birth to her 4th child by her father. No doctors. No hospital. No witnesses. Just Aswad delivering another baby. Another child born into secrecy. They named her Coco. And Coco was born with spinal muscular atrophy and PKU. Two severe genetic conditions caused by both parents carrying recessive genes. Both parents. The same parents. Because Aswad was both father and grandfather. Through the foster care process, Aziza was required to attend classes, therapy, parenting workshops. And in those rooms, she learned the truth about her life. She learned that what her father did had a name: incestuous abuse, sexual assault, pedophilia. She learned that mothers who allow abuse are called enablers. She learned that isolation is a control tactic. She learned that what she thought was love, staying to protect her siblings, was actually trauma bonding. For the first time in her life, Aziza had language for her pain. And language is power. She started looking for cracks in her father's system. Ways to escape. People who might actually help. Her caseworker, the one who finally listened, told her something revolutionary: you don't have to live like this. Aziza didn't believe her at first. But the seed was planted. Meanwhile, her children were in foster care. And the system decided they should be placed with family. Aziza's maternal grandmother, the same woman whose house she'd grown up in, became the foster parent. Full circle. Aziza reconnected with that side of her family. The side she'd been isolated from. And they saw her children. They saw the evidence. They knew. And this time, they didn't look away. Aziza had been gathering courage for weeks. She'd told someone outside the family, someone her father respected, about the abuse. She'd asked him not to tell Aswad. To help without telling him. But secrets in that family never stayed buried long. One night, Aswad was about to take one of Aziza's sisters into a bedroom. The sister was already pregnant with his child. And something in Aziza snapped. All the years of pain. All the nights of rape. All the manipulation and control and lies. It erupted. She exploded on him. Called him every name she'd never been allowed to say. Told him exactly what he was. A rapist. A pedophile. A monster. She turned to her mother and screamed at her too: how could you let this happen? You're no better than him. Then she grabbed her sister. Took her into the bedroom. Locked the door. And waited for the consequences. But something unexpected happened. Aswad didn't hit her. Didn't threaten her. Didn't break down the door. He just sat down. He was in shock. For 20 years, Aziza had been compliant. Submissive. Broken. And now, suddenly, she was fighting back. And he didn't know what to do. By the next morning, he was gone. And he never came back. If you made it to this point, drop your comment with "I got here." Let's see how far our story got to you. After Aswad left, Aziza's mother filed for a domestic violence restraining order. Not because Deborah had suddenly grown a spine. But because Aziza's contact, the person she'd told about the abuse, had connections to law enforcement. And the consequences were becoming real. Deborah filed the order to protect herself. To avoid criminal charges. To maintain the illusion that she was a victim too. Which, to be fair, she was. But she was also complicit. The restraining order was granted. And for the first time in over 20 years, Aziza lived in a house without her father. She worked through the foster care system. Attended every class. Passed every evaluation. Proved she could be a safe parent. And 10 days before her children were set to be adopted by someone else, she got them back. Full custody. She'd done it. But freedom came with complications. Aziza was still struggling with the psychological damage of 2 decades of abuse. Her children had been separated and traumatized by foster care. Her sisters were still trapped in the cycle, some blaming Aziza for what happened to them. And Aswad? He was still out there. Still free. Still unpunished. That would take another few years. For a few years after escaping, Aziza focused on survival. On her children. On healing. But there was unfinished business. Her father had raped 5 daughters. Fathered at least 6 children through incest. Possibly had 21 children total with various women. And he was walking free. Aziza and her sisters made a decision: they would go to the police. This wasn't easy. One sister wanted nothing to do with it. Another blamed Aziza for the abuse. But enough of them agreed. They walked into a police station and filed a report. What followed was a masterclass in how the justice system fails survivors. First, they had to prove Aswad was Aziza's father. DNA test. Then they had to prove he was the father of her children. More DNA tests. Then they had to prove he'd threatened their lives. Testimonies. Evidence. And here's the kicker: incest is legal in New Jersey once you turn 18. Read that again. Legal. So any abuse that happened to Aziza after her 18th birthday, years of rape, pregnancies, control, could only be prosecuted if it was violent. The prosecutor, Lisa's secretary, worked tirelessly to build a case. But the obstacles were enormous. Some judges were dismissed because they openly questioned why the sisters waited so long to report. The detective who took the initial report made Aziza feel like she was being interrogated, not protected. And through it all, Aswad was out there. Watching. Waiting. When Aziza walked into the courtroom to testify, she was 35 years old. She thought she was ready. She'd healed. She had her children. She'd built a new life. But the moment she saw her father, she regressed. She became 8 years old again. All the fear. All the helplessness. It came flooding back. She could feel his eyes on her. And her body responded the way it had been trained to respond for 2 decades, by shutting down. But she didn't run. She collected herself. And she testified. The defense attorney was a woman. Strategic choice. She challenged everything Aziza said. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you fight back? Why did you have 4 children if you were being abused? Every victim-blaming question you can imagine. Aziza answered them all. She described things only she and her father knew. Details of the abuse. The rooms. The threats. The pregnancies. And the jury listened. Some of them looked skeptical. One woman rolled her eyes every time Aziza spoke. But others cried. Aziza's mother testified too. Not because she wanted to. But because testifying against Aswad meant she wouldn't be charged as an accomplice. She took the stand. Confirmed some details. Protected herself. And then, on the day of sentencing, Deborah went on a cruise. She wasn't there to support her daughter. She was on vacation. The verdict came in: guilty. Aswad was sentenced to 90 years in prison. He stood there, even then, denying it. Aziza, you know the truth, he said. Yes. She did. And that's why he was going to prison. October 17th. A date burned into Aziza's memory. Coco, her youngest daughter, the one born in a tent on a Florida beach, died at 9 years old. She had spinal muscular atrophy. A degenerative condition that weakened her muscles. She was in a wheelchair. Required around-the-clock care. But she was also full of life. She loved horror movies. Justin Bieber. Giving orders to everyone around her. She was the baby of the family but acted like the oldest. And Aziza loved her fiercely. The day Coco died, Aziza wasn't even home. She'd taken a rare day trip with her sisters to Great Adventure Amusement Park. Coco was home with her grandmother and her nurse. Aziza got a call. She's not breathing. By the time Aziza got home, her daughter was gone. The medical examiner refused to do an autopsy. They labeled it as complications from her condition. But Aziza has questions. The nurse didn't know how to open the oxygen tank during the emergency. Food was spilled everywhere. The nursing agency took all the notes. Aziza believes negligence played a role. And she carries guilt. If I'd stayed home that day, maybe she'd still be here. Grief doesn't follow logic. And survivors of trauma already carry so much blame. Losing Coco broke something in Aziza. But it also galvanized her. If she couldn't save her daughter, she could save someone else's. Today, Aziza Kibibi is 40-something years old. Her children are in their 20s and 30s. They know the truth. They've always known. Aziza told them when they were old enough to understand. And remarkably, they're thriving. They're creative. Confident. They sing, dance, write, act. They have no shame about their origins. When strangers joke that Aziza and her kids look like siblings, they laugh about it. If only they knew. Aziza founded Precious Little Ladies Incorporated, an organization dedicated to ending sexual abuse and incestuous violence. She wrote a memoir, Unashamed, that sold out multiple times on Amazon. She's working to pass Aziza's Law in New Jersey, legislation that would criminalize incest for adults, closing the legal loophole that allowed her father to escape some charges. She's a public speaker, a podcaster, a poet. And she plans to visit her father in prison. Not for closure. Not for forgiveness. But to understand. And to test herself. To see if the little girl who was afraid of him is finally, completely gone. Aziza's story doesn't have a clean ending. Her relationship with her mother is distant. Some of her sisters still blame her. Her ex-husband had affairs with 2 of her sisters. The trauma ripples outward. But Aziza is no longer defined by what was done to her. She's defined by what she's doing now. And that's the most powerful revenge of all. Every year, thousands of children are abused by family members. Behind closed doors. In plain sight. Aziza's story is extreme. But the mechanisms that allowed it are not. Isolation. Control. Complicit bystanders. Systems that fail to act. Her father's police officer friend suspected something. Did nothing. Family members saw signs. Gossiped. Stayed silent. Social workers saw red flags. Took some children but not others. One girl's courage on a hospital form wasn't enough to stop 2 decades of abuse. That's the real horror. Not just that monsters exist. But that we allow them to thrive. Aziza Kibibi survived. Her children survived. But how many others didn't? And how many are still trapped right now, in houses like the one in East Orange, waiting for someone to notice? This is her story. But it's also a warning. Silence protects predators. And the cost of silence is always paid by children. Before you go, tell us, which story do you want to be covered next? We see you in the comments section and your suggestions might be the next video that saves someone. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next one.